Hello and welcome to our webinar titled Ethics in Counseling. My name is Robbie Fuqua and I will be your presenter today. Now this webinar is brought to you by the Illinois Department of Human Services and conducted by yours truly. And the company I work for is actually Morneau Shepell. In case you don't know who we are, we manage the 1-800-GAMBLER line for the state of Illinois. We provide crisis counseling and referral services to state-funded and private practitioners for not only problem gamblers, but their loved ones as well. So a little bit about myself. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, licensed in the great state of Illinois. I got my master's in social work from Boston College, and I have a background in crisis work in hospital settings. And of course, I've worked in the addiction field for years. And I actually started with Morneau Shepell when we were actually BDA as a clinical associate working the gambling lines, including Illinois. I worked C2C cases, which is the Call to Change program, which is a counseling program that helps folks with problem gambling issues or gambling disorder itself, along with the other helpline states that we offer our problem gambling services to. We handle, I believe, 8 states now. But a little bit more about what we do in the responsible gambling department of Morneau Shepell. As I said, we handle Illinois and other states, and we provide trainings like this webinar to both providers and retailers, casinos, and other entities in the gambling industry. We also do prevention programming, research and white papers, and we work with GameSense and provide responsible gaming information centers globally. Okay, I also want to talk a little bit more, since this is a call for Illinois. I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing with our fiscal year 2020 busy training schedule, which I would like to review with you real quickly what we've done this year and what we're kind of in the middle of doing at this time. Now, we conducted, 2 additional 5-day gambling disorder workshops that we conducted last month in October. And I just finished one this past Tuesday in Lombard. Now, the big change here is, as you can see on the screen, that we've moved away from a 5-day format because there's 4 days. And that meant actually longer days, but we were able to cut a full day out of the training schedule. So instead of just going like 9 to 4:30, we go from 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. That is, of course, to meet that 30-hour CEU requirement if you're working towards the PCGC certification that's been reinstated by IODAPCA. So it still meets that requirement. I will tell you, in October, November, and hearing from and looking at the evaluations, the 4-day is much more desirable than the 5-day, right? So we were able to save you actually a day at work, and so that you could get to your caseloads and your supervising. So the 4-day seems to have worked out. Now, we did the 4-day at Remedies. We're doing lives in Rockford, Illinois. I had about 25, 30 participants. And then recently here in Lombard, we did it at the Embassy Suites. And we had, I believe, probably on average over 50. I haven't done an actual count yet, but it was a larger group. So class went well, workshop went well, and we're planning potentially for February in Lombard. Don't quote me there, but we will have locations and dates locked in soon, and we'll let you know when that happens. We also did the ICB conference in spring, mid-March of this year. I believe that was in the Chicagoland area. And we also did it down in Mount Vernon in the fall back in mid-October, and we did a talk on special populations of problem gambling, specifically veterans, women in gambling, and young adults. So as you can see, we've been very busy, and we are in the middle of our 6th webinar campaign, you can call it, that we've worked out with the Illinois Department of Human Services. We've come up with 6 subject matter that we feel that is important, and we started back in September. Actually, if you were able to join us, it was the sports betting evolution of sports betting in the U.S. And if you were unable to catch that, you can log into weknowthefeeling.com website. You can Google that, weknowthefeeling.com, Illinois gambling or what have you, and it'll take you to, you'll be able to find the website, and we have our recorded webinars there. This one will be on there in the coming days, so you can expect this to be posted hopefully in the next week or two, maybe even sooner, but you can get these recordings on weknowthefeeling.com. Now, January 14th is our next one. We're gonna do a talk on gambling in the prison system. I've had a lot of folks in the 4-day and 5-day gambling workshops ask about gambling in the prison system. So that one comes next on January 14th. And just so you know, via the Supra notifications and alerts, we will let you know 2 to 3 weeks out the link where you can register. And from the link, you'll get instructions on how to log in and participate in our webinars. And if you're hearing my voice now, you already know how to do that. But if you have colleagues or friends or whomever in the addictions field or in the mental health field at all, even educators, we welcome educators and administrators too, pass on the link to them. And then we have 3 others after that. February, we have Veterans and Gambling, and March, Gambling, Gaming, and Young Adults. And we finish up the campaign or the 6-day webinar schedule or 6 webinar schedule in April when we do a talk on suicide, problem gambling, and gambling disorder. Okay, so please note today, before we get started, in order to receive your CEU for our webinars, you must be logged into a laptop or personal computer or some type of tablet where you can answer 3 polling questions that I'm going to pose during the presentation. Now, you must be able to answer all 3, and you must be on the call for the 1-hour session, right? So after today's webinar, I'm going to mail you, or Colin, look for Colin's name in the email. It's Colin Cattell, Cattell, or myself will email you an evaluation form. Just scan or fax that thing back to us, and we'll get you a certificate for your CEU today, and we'll get you going, okay? All right. Now, as I've been presenting in the 4-day gambling workshops and in the webinars, I want to set up today's call with what gambling looks like in our great state of Illinois, right? Right now, currently, there's 4 options: riverboat or casino gambling, lottery gambling, video gaming machines. Now, just so you know, we have the most machines, standalone machines in the nation, more so than even Nevada, okay? So that's definitely an option for folks who live in Illinois. And then also there's race tracks, horse track betting, right? I believe at one time we had 5. I think we're still around 3 to 5, but that is an available legal option to gamble in this state as well. Now, the reason I like to show these different types of gambling is it's going to better prepare you for what might be walking into your agencies and practices, right? And with saying that, on top of these 4 avenues, we've had some legislation. If you haven't watched the news in the past several months, right? There's been some legislation that's come down, and there's a 5th legal option coming to us very soon, and that's legalized sports gambling. So that'll be a 5th option, and once that happens, I'm going to add that to the previous slide. But along with legalized sports gambling, I do want to tell you a little bit about some other legislation. There's going to be 6 additional casinos in Illinois on top of the 10. There's a Hard Rock that's going up in Rockford already, if it hasn't finished yet. And we all know there's been a lot of talk about a downtown casino that they're progressing on as well. Also, with the racetracks, they are going to combine their efforts with casinos, and they're going to combine creating what we call racinos, which is a combination casino with a racetrack. So you can be inside and play those EGMs or electronic gambling and gaming machines, and on top of that, you can go outside and bet on the ponies as well, or stay inside and bet on the ponies, but you can bet on them live at a racino. Now, all this is going to happen with the continued growth of the electronic gambling machine industry in our state. So you see these machines everywhere, right? You see them in truck stops. You see them in restaurants. I saw them in the place where I had my shoes worked on in the Loop and Shoe Shine. They're everywhere. So with all this coming, And already here in Illinois, as we speak, this is the very reason the Illinois Department of Human Services has put us to task, has put us to work to get everybody trained and up to speed. Now, we can't predict the future and say, hey, look, this with more increased legal options, there's going to be higher prevalence rates. We're not saying that's going to happen, but it's better to be prepared, right, than to be caught by surprise. So that's why we've done 4 gambling disorder workshops this year, and that's why we're doing these 6 webinars on top of that. Okay, so let's get to what we're going to talk about today, right? Is everybody ready for an exciting 1 hour of ethics? 1 hour full session of ethics. The good news is it's just an hour, and actually it's under an hour from now because I've been talking for 5 or 10 minutes. But the good news is you're going to get your ethics CEU. So if you're a social worker, and we all know with social workers, we're supposed to be renewing our license here. We got about a week to get the rest of our CEUs in. This can serve for your last CEU regarding ethics. In all seriousness, I hope that we put together something somewhat interesting, albeit the fact that it is ethics in counseling. Now, I'm going to start today with an intro, and then I'm going to move into 7 ethical theories, which I think is going to serve as a foundation for the rest of our talk. We're then going to cover 8 ethical standards with a few slides dedicated to the unique struggles that clinicians who serve any population connected to addiction often face in their practices and agencies. All the CADCs out there, all you PCGCs, you'll know what I'm talking about when I get to these slides. We have some unique, or you have some unique, I don't know, situations sometimes that ethically you have to make some decisions. We'll talk about them. And then we're going to talk about a study I found regarding research funding, actually funding related to gambling disorder in Canada. So it's a study I found to believe that will have some implication here in the United States as well. But I just plan to run over it real quickly to look at the ethical considerations when actually the funding source is tied to the source that actually provides the services. I'll talk more about that near the end of the webinar today. I do want to say before I begin, I hope this is new and helpful information for you. This might all be review, but either way, I hope it gives you some perspective and some knowledge to better serve not only your problem gambling clients, but your whole caseload, whatever addiction they're facing or mood disorder or why ever they come to you for help. We hope that this material will help you better serve that population. I will also say, if you have questions, just chat me. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's hard for me to get to chats because of the amount of information I have. If I'm unable to get to them, I'll get to you via email, okay? All right, let's get started. Now, as a part of the introduction, I want to present a few of the professional organizations that serve as a resource for your ethical mandates in your respective areas of licensure, starting with the 2 national level ones, the ACA, the American Counseling Association, and also one that I go to because I'm an LCSW, the National Association of Social Workers, both at the national level, but I also put in a good local one too, IODAPCA, the Illinois Certification Board. I will tell you, they are very responsive and so helpful. Call them, look at them online. They are very helpful and can help you in just not only ethical mandates, but other things as well. Now, I'm sure that we have several, if not all, CADCs and counselors that serve populations that suffer from all types of addictions, substance use disorder, process addictions like gambling. But when we look at counseling and ethics, it's important to note that we often face some very unique situations and challenges brought about by the very nature of the discipline itself, and coupled with the client population that CADCs and PCGCs serve. So needless to say, I think it's important to stay informed and aware of the ethical standards that are mandated in our field of work so that we can better serve our clients and literally ourselves and our practices. We can achieve this by attending trainings like what you're doing right now, in true diligence regarding staying informed on any changes in the ethical playing field, if you will, that's set forth by your respective professional agency through reading and engagement with all these professional organizations, the three that I just showed you, and others out there. But in the end, I think it's Aristotle's virtue theory that states it best by saying the first rule includes doing no harm, doing only what's best or good for our clients. Don't you agree with that? I mean, remember that in our field, the full burden of the ethical relationship and the ethical responsibility lies with us, the clinician. So if you're ever facing an ethical dilemma of any sort, reference this theory. Remember, do only good for the client and put their interest above your own, because that should be your compass. That will steer you in the right direction if you ever question an ethical situation. If there's a walk away from this, remember that. So in other words, when in doubt, do only good for the client. And that comes from Aristotle's virtue theory. So let's talk now about ethical theories. Now, I'm going to define them here real quickly, but then I'm going to give you a few examples to give you some context or more meaning behind these definitions. Now, some of these theories get a little deep, but I wanted to provide a foundation for what we're going to be talking about today. Now, the first one from the left here is virtue ethics. Now, this is where personal character is based upon society's values, or an individual's character mirrors their respective community or society. For example, we can probably say that the United States, the U.S. society, is based on liberty and justice, right? And if our society values punishment as a deterrent to keep us in line with liberty and justice, then I think we should perhaps, do we use corporal punishment as a deterrent to keep those in line for liberty and justice? And if so, perhaps individuals will mirror that ethical theory. Now, when I talk about deontology, we're looking at absolutes and definitives, imperatives, or white and black. And believe me, it's either black or white, right? Or white and black. Many religions and religious beliefs prescribe to this theory. Now, teleology is a little bit, well, it's a lot different. It's almost opposite. It focuses on the end result, meaning whatever results from one's actions is what's deemed good or bad, or ethical or not ethical. For instance, I talked about deontology. If you cheat to win, that is not a deontology perspective, that is a teleology. Cheating is part of the process that's unethical, but the end result is winning. That's teleology, and that's ethical in their eyes. Deontology, that wouldn't fly because cheating is unethical. In other words, a deontologist would play by the rules because it's ethical, even if it meant losing. Teleology is the opposite. They would cheat and it would be okay because they're going to win. Motivists base its ethical principles not on any theory, but on what's best for that individual. Natural law bases its viewpoints on there is both good and evil in the world, and we should only do good. Now, transcultural theory states that all interaction is transcultural because all the strengths and values of basically mankind are within its society's culture. So in other words, whatever the culture said is ethical, that's what dictates. And finally, the feminist theory states, well, it actually questions the origin, meaning, and implications of societal's established gender roles. It states gender equality actually enhances society as a whole, and that's what deems ethical. Now, here are the 5 examples I was telling you about. Let's go back to deontology and teleology. A person who tells the truth, even if it leads to great personal harm, is considered to be a deontologist or deontological. Excuse me. So, in other words, if someone was in court and they had to testify and they said, I can't lie because it's unethical, and telling the truth means that one of their friends or family member got killed in the streets, that would still seem ethical to a deontologist. Teleology, it's different. Robin Hood stealing to feed the hungry is a teleology example. Stealing is unethical. Feeding the hungry is the end result, which is good. So that would be an example of teleology. Supporting slavery to support economic advantages for the majority, teleology view. Slavery is obviously unethical. But what this sentence is saying is if some portion of the society had economic advantage, in some view, that would be teleology. Again, um, uh, doing something unethical for a perceived end result. When asked by the police, another example of transcultural would be reporting the location of individuals who are hiding from genocidal regime. Okay, if that's consistent with what your culture says is ethical, then you would point that person out. And then finally, motivist, lying to achieve for personal gain. It's not prescribing to any theory. It's just saying, hey, this is going to work out best for me, and that's what's ethical. So those are the examples to the ethical theories. So that brings us to our first poll question. Give me 1 second. We'll get this thing. It's a true or false, real easy one. Let me get it. Let me launch it. Okay, so I've launched it. True or false? The deontology approach or deontological approach views ethical behavior from an absolute or definitive perspective, meaning it's black or white. Deontology says, hey, I can't tell a lie, even if the result is bad. So the deontological approach views ethical behavior from an absolute or definitive perspective, black or white. Is that true or is that false? We've got about half of you who voted, so I'll wait another few seconds here. It's what religions and religious belief, it's what they prescribe to. Is this true or this false? Now remember, even if you don't get this right, that doesn't mean that as long as you participate on these polls, that's what we're looking at. But hopefully you'll get this one right. Okay, I'll wait a few more seconds. About 75% has voted. I think that's all that's going to vote. 5 seconds. Oh, we have number 14. Okay. All right, it's true. So what we're saying is the deontological approach is it's absolute or definitive, white or black. So it's about process. So what we're saying is even if the end result is bad, as long as you do what's ethical, that's all that matters. Okay. So now that we have a basic understanding of ethical theory, right? Let's look at 8 core ethical standards and how they are handled or applied in the mental health or behavioral health industry. These are the 8 I'm going to talk about. Going in a clockwise section from the left, we're going to talk about competence, not necessarily in this order though, guys. We're going to talk about fees for service, disclosure and informed consent, confidentiality, non-discrimination, and respectful treatment. I'm actually going to start with that one. Evaluation and assessment, treatment planning and documentation, and termination. Throughout the discussion of these 8 ethical principles, I'm also going to highlight some topics for discussion regarding the unique aspects of addictions counseling. In counseling that we spoke about in the intro, and specifically speak to what to look out for and how to handle in an ethical manner when we work in the field of addiction, right? Okay. So starting with non-discrimination and respectful treatment, we first want to encourage client growth and development, and we want to protect clients from being traumatized by treatment. We want to avoid dependent and unhealthy relationships. And we obviously, when we talk about respectful treatment, we want to stay away from any derogatory language, humiliating our clients or intimidating them or even manipulating them, even to try to be willing or to do the therapies that we're coaching them on, right? We want to provide a safe space for our folks. Now look at the left side of the screen. These are all potential areas that we might differ in opinion with our clients. And we need to be mindful of these. that just because we might have a difference of opinion regarding or having, in a different age bracket, different religion, be of different race, we have to be mindful of these and still make that connection, okay? Now, what I would like you to do is look at the bottom left. And I want you to think about political views, okay, and the state of our nation, okay? This is literally a firebed for discussion right now. I want you to think about for a second a client who directly opposes your political beliefs, who comes in for an assessment for a gambling addiction, a substance addiction, a mood disorder. Either they voted for Donald Trump or they didn't vote for Donald Trump. They voted for Hillary Clinton or they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. What I'm saying here is we have to be mindful. I think it's important to say that with any of these potential areas, if we feel internally unable to counsel because of our differences, because of feelings that are inside of us because of our difference, we need to do a referral, right? I had a friend where this actually happened to a personal friend on the other side who was a client for a therapist, who his thoughts, and he liked the voice's opinion about his clinical beliefs. He was pretty sure his therapist didn't line up with that, and there was some awkwardness. This is one of the reasons I'm bringing up this point, is if we're unable to set those differences to the side and do what Aristotle says by putting our clients before ourselves, then what's ethically right is to give them a quality referral, right? And just not political views. I brought that up because of where our nation is right now, right? But with anything, race, religion, age, gender, you name it. Okay, let's talk about competence. Now, how long does it take for someone to become competent? Now, there is a Canadian journalist, his name is Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote the book Outliers, and he suggested it takes 10,000 hours at something to be an expert. Now, do you agree with this? In our field, minimum competence standards are based on academic training, school, and supervised clinical experience. And this culminates in our licensures, right? Our LCPCs, our LCSWs. So we must be aware of the guidelines and standards that are applicable to these areas of specialization. Now, I will tell you, before we go to the next slide, incompetence wasn't the most reported area of ethical complaints at this research journal that we actually sourced, but it was the second highest counselor complaint. Again, counselor incompetence is. Think about that. Think about if you were the client, you didn't feel confident that the person who's helping you with your presenting issue and pain was competent to help you through that, right? Because of experience in education and supervision. Now, the first reported, you're probably asking, well, what was the number one reported ethical complaint? It was dual relationships. We're going to talk about that in a few slides. Now, staying with competence here, when we look at addictions work through the competency lens, we all know that there are several different types of credentials, several different types of licensures that the system sees fit to qualify you to work with clients that suffer from addiction disorders. These licensures come with different education levels, everything from a GED to a PhD, and different amounts also of supervised service experience requirements. Think about the LCPC, the LCSW, they come with higher educational requirements, and those more specialized credentials of CADC and PCGC are set to work exclusively with specific populations like substance use disorders, our problem gambling clients. And as many of you know, in our field of work, we combine our licensures and our credentials to get most of those 4-letter acronyms behind our name that we can. But this ensures that we are competent with education and supervised clinical experience so that we can work in the addiction field, right? We combine these. For instance, we add a CADC or a PCGC to our LCSW, right? I think either way, it's important that therapists and clinicians in our field adhere to the statement that I found. It's a very simple statement, and basically it says that we must adopt an attitude of lifelong learning and understanding to seek access to relevant research related to addictions counseling. We need to remain coachable, right? We need to keep up with the latest research. And I think it's also worth mentioning at this point that we need to respect each other's licensures, right? And credentials, and work together, because we're all in this together to serve our clients, to help them through those mental health challenges that they're facing, of why they're in our offices. Now, fees for service, part or what's inherent in the therapeutic relationship is that exchange of services for something of value, right? When you place value on something, it usually costs you something. So if someone's receiving a service for free, then the theory goes, they're not going to value it as if they had to pay something for that, right? Now, that's just something to think about. I'm all for a sliding scale. I'm all for, I think that's, and that's up to you, but, you can offer sliding scales and pro bono, but I'm just saying, in the eyes of the clients, they seem to value something a lot of times that they pay for, although some are not in a position to be able to pay. And that's why we do offer sliding scales, and that's why we offer free services as a percentage of our caseload. But I do want to say there are two reasons why, speaking of that, you can terminate ethically because lack of payment. Two things, or two have-tos regarding termination for the lack of payment must exist before we terminate. And the first one is, it's only when the client is not in danger to themselves or others, and only when the consequences of non-payment have been discussed. So this must have been discussed. I would make clear up front your policy or consequences of non-payment, and that has to be undone. And then also, when we know that they're not in danger to themselves or others, that's the only time that we suggest or recommend, if you do terminate for lack of payments, is when that happens. We want to make sure that they're safe, and that they knew that's what, and therapeutically, that might be the best thing for them. And it engages the client to be accountable and responsible for the services that they're receiving. Okay, with disclosure and informed consent. Now, clients have the right to choose when to enter therapy. They also, with whom, and also they have the right to end therapy. That might be a couple of sessions to ending therapy, but when they say they're done, they have that right to be done. And they're entitled to full disclosure, especially if you're doing some type of like online counseling or phone counseling. We want to talk to them and let them know about the risks that might be involved. It's a nice consideration to perhaps ask before you take notes, or especially if you tape on your phone or observe, or if there's observations of the therapy session. And we also want to disclose the techniques, the risks that are involved, even the benefits, and how it's going to work on the particular modality, or what we're going to do regarding our therapy upon our folks who come into our agencies and recovery centers. Now, when we look at informed consent in the addiction world with the initial meeting, because a lot of times with our initial meeting with the client, right, if there's an intervention involved, if there's detox involved, treatment services are often initiated during a turbulent circumstance, right? Either the client is under the influence of a substance, or boundaries have already been set by family members, like in an intervention, which can create conflicts within the family and some true awkwardness. They might also be suffering from some different mental health issues at the time of intake. They might be under varying degrees of cognitive dysfunction, according to Goldman. Clinicians must consider and respect the client's right of consent to continue or withdraw from treatment on their own volition. So what we're saying is, we need to consider and respect our client's choice to continue or withdraw from treatment after the dust settles on these very unsettling initial intake moments. That might involve detox or an intervention. This is a great opportunity also for us to engage our motivational interviewing skills to guide the client to make an informed, rational decision. But remember, it's their decision. Once the dust settles, they come out of detox or the intervention, that they usually have to choose, right? And we have to respect that. Another unique, you could call it unique, but another thing that we run into as you folks as CADCs or, who work in the addiction field. Okay. Now, when it comes to evaluation and assessments, the client has a right to a thorough and accurate assessment, an accurate diagnosis, and also they have the right to train clinicians performing these assessments. Now, this involves using evidence-based techniques, updated assessment tools at the hands of tenured clinicians to perform these assessments. If interns or even newly licensed clinicians are included in the process, there of course needs to be sufficient clinical supervision. I think back to my first job in the industry before I even went to school, before I had any experience. Now that I look back, I wonder if I should have been doing what I was doing. I was working under the supervision of a great clinical supervisor who had years of experience, but boy, they had me doing a lot, which I was happy to do, but we want to make sure that our folks are being taken care of by some tenured clinicians with evidence-based tools and approaches. So when we talk about treatment planning and documentation, clients have the right to, of course, accurate, timely treatment planning and record keeping. Think about it. They're putting their mental health or their loved ones' mental health and condition in our hands. So we must be focused and organized. The client is a partner in treatment planning. Now, we need to remember, we need their buy-in and their motivation to make this work. So that must be considered. We must plan to have a reasonable expectation of success. We don't want to set our clients up for failure, so we want to make sure that the treatment plan is doable for the individual. And finally, the client has a right to review the record at any time. We don't want to hide anything from them. We want to stay as transparent as we can, So that's something to consider when we're talking about treatment planning and documentation and ethics. And termination, I think first and foremost, termination should always be based on the best interests of the client. Now, we hope that treatment is being terminated by the fact of our outstanding therapeutic approaches and planning and skills to help them resolve the presenting issue, right? But terminations also should be a result if the client just isn't benefiting from the therapy anymore and could perhaps be like dependent upon the therapist, you, in an unhealthy way, and continuing would actually be harmful to them. So that's another reason we would want to terminate. And then finally, the most obvious reason here is we shouldn't be terminating in order to pursue something, a selfish motive, especially a sexual motive or a business relationship or even a social motive, right? So all these things must be considered when we're talking about ethically terminating services in our field with a client. This is Confidentiality 101. I know you guys all probably know this, but I'm doing a talk on ethics, so I got to roll this off my tongue. Private or client identifying information cannot be shared without written consent. Of course, we know that. This includes courts, family members, third-party payers, and media. We need to make sure that we're storing records in a safe spot, appropriate place, locked up. This applies even after death. Clients should understand the limits and be informed in regards to confidentiality standards, procedures, and laws. And then finally, we only reveal essential information. In other words, even after we get their permission, we need to only answer what's asked, right? No more, no less. Answer what's asked, even with permission. And then we need to inform our clients exactly what we told the source, even, again, after we have permission. That brings us to poll question number 2 that I'm going to launch here, if I can do it. Okay. And it asks, under what circumstances is it deemed appropriate to terminate services due to lack of payment? Is it A, only after non-payment consequences have been clearly communicated to the client? Is it B, only when the client is not in danger to themselves or others? Is it C, after 6 weeks of treatment? Or is it both? Or is it D, A and B? Okay. So you guys almost all have this correct. I hope you do. Under what circumstances is it deemed appropriate for ethically to terminate services due to lack of payment? Is it only after non-payment consequences have been communicated to the client, A, or B, only when the client is not in danger to themselves or others? Is it C, only after 6 weeks of treatment? Or is it D, both A and B, only after you communicate it to them and they're not in danger to themselves or others? So we got about 58% voted. I'll wait about a few more seconds so we can continue. So far, we're 100% right. We've got 11 who's answered. Okay. 5 more seconds. We've got 64% of the vote. Okay. It was both A and B, right? So it's only after we've clearly communicated to them the consequence that would happen if non-payment happens, and only when they're not in danger to themselves or others. And we all know on this call, this is not about money. This is really about accountability on their side. I think it can be therapeutic to have them accountable and responsible to be for their treatment financially as well. Okay. So now we're going to conclude this section with a review on a few things that I think are important when we talk about ethics in the mental health field. Starting with maintaining boundaries, we're going to talk about dual relationships and some other relationships that might be questionable, ethically questionable, when we talk about the mental health field. Okay, this is Dr. Sullivan, an American psychiatrist, and he focused on interpersonal relations. And he made this following statement that reiterates what we said earlier regarding competence and that first rule of ethical behavior, which is do no harm, right? Psychotherapy is a unique profession in that it requires therapists to set aside their own needs in the services of addressing the patient's needs. Now, does this happen with other professions, like in the medical field with doctors, in the legal field with lawyers, in the educational field with teachers? What do you think? Now, to ensure that we do no harm to those we serve, we must service our clients' needs before our own. And how do we do that? We do that with boundaries, right? Now, boundaries they provide a framework that surrounds the therapeutic relationship, identifying a set of roles for the therapist and the client, but they are created for the client. We want to avoid relationships with people that work for us, that we work for, friends, and heavens knows, family members, right? Now, moving into relationships, here are several scenarios that could be deemed as complicated, right? For instance, we could have someone walk into our office we've had a previous relationship with in the past, either it's a personal relationship, work, business, social, or romantic. We could ultimately run into past clients, current clients, and in literally a million different ways or capacities that will eventually lead our lives to cross paths. The thing again to remember is that the full burden of maintaining the ethical relationship and the ethical responsibility with those that we serve in our agencies and practices falls on you, on me, on us. So it's our responsibility to maintain and manage this responsibility through these complicated situations here, effectively putting the client's welfare first. Now, dual relationships non-professional relationships, what we need to remember is when we need to document for our case records prior to the interaction, if at all possible, the rationale for such an interaction. If there's a non-professional relationship that's tied to that. Here's some examples. But such interaction should be initiated with appropriate client consent. They have to sign off on that. Where unintentional harm occurs to the client or to the individual significantly involved with the client due to a non-professional interaction. Like what? Like attending a formal ceremony, a wedding, a commitment ceremony, maybe purchasing a service or a product from the client, or a former client, or hospital visits to an ill family members that's connected to the client, or mutual members in a professional association, organization, or community. Now think about this, okay? Dual relationships can be another unique challenge, and unique challenge for counselors in recovery in the addiction field, specifically speaking to counselors in recovery that actively attend local 12-step groups. There's a very good chance you're going to run into a current or past client if you're serving folks who suffer from addictions, or even future clients. You never know. Boundaries and anonymity can definitely be compromised. I can tell you I've personally witnessed this type of situation in my career. And professionally, the counselor has to balance the welfare of their clients' needs while maintaining the priority of their own recovery program, right? Now, this perhaps can be advised by their sponsor and their peer-based group, either if it's NA, AA, and then they can talk through this with their clinical supervisor on the professional side. That's only if they feel comfortable with disclosing this with their supervisor at work. Either way, again, it's the counselor. It's our responsibility to work this out. It's a balance, right? So keeping a priority of the recovery in the counselor's life while serving the client. It's another unique situation that we run into if you are in recovery in this industry, in this field. Now, this one isn't so complicated. This is pretty somewhat simple. This is kind of the DEFCON 5 relationship amongst the no-nos of unethical relationships in the mental health field, right? Oftentimes with romantic and sexual relationships, there's a role reversal where the therapist needs are met. And that breaks that virtue, that Aristotle's virtue rule, and that knocks it right out the window. And you'll hear statements, I guess, like things just got out of hand from the therapist. In these instances, the clinician takes advantage of perhaps like a non-sexual physical contact that leads to other things. They exploit the therapeutic relationship. The relationship moves on beyond each session. Worst case scenarios include clinicians who use drugs to facilitate seduction, or clinicians who use threats or intimidation, thus manipulating the therapeutic relationship and exploiting client dependence. Research shows that therapist profiles that usually fits this, that violates the professional boundary of a mental health clinician onto a client, are those who are professionally isolated male therapists that are experiencing concerns in their life or midlife crises. They are also uninformed, and they tend to have some sociopathic and narcissistic symptoms or characteristic elements that are somewhat access to or characteristics of personality, borderline personality disorder. Now, everyone who's been in this field for some time has experienced countertransference, I'm sure, and it might and can trigger something internally, which what we're saying here is feeling attraction to a client is not unethical, but acting on it is. That's what's unethical. Studies show that up to 95% have been attracted to at least one client. 7% of male counselors reported sexual relationships, where 1.6 female counselors reported a sexual relationship in their work. And 80% who reported having had some type of romantic relationship with a client also reported multiple relationships like that. Here are a couple of codes under the ACA. It states that sexual or romantic counselor-client interactions, relationships with current clients, their romantic partners, or their family members are prohibited. The NASW takes a pretty hard line on this. Social workers should not engage in sexual activities or sexual contact with former clients because of the potential harm to the client. Now, it goes without saying that our clients are already in a very vulnerable position in their personal lives and within the power structure, you can call it, or the therapeutic relationship with us. Now, a client often experiences any or a combination of these presenting issues after a romantic or sexual relationship with their therapist occurs. Guilt, rage, isolation, also because of that exploitation that I told you of the therapeutic relationship. They can get confused, they can have trust issues and other relationships where it's uneven. if you can call it that. Depending on the nature of the background or the relationship of the client or the relationship itself, it's possible to have confusion regarding sexuality. And worst case scenario, there might be increased risk of suicide ideation. Here's a length of prohibition for each organization, ACA, before you can consider, I guess, these relationships. Again, the NASW says never. ACA says 5 years. The APA, the American Psychological Association, says 2 years, and the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy is 2 years. In addition to the complications that develop in regard to these different types of relationships and the multiple relationships within the therapeutic relationship, there's also role changing. This is when the counselor changes a role from the original role that they first had and moving into another role. Examples include changing from individual relationship to family or couples therapy, or vice versa. Changing from a non-forensic evaluative role to a therapeutic role, or vice versa. From a counselor to a researcher, or enlisting clients as a research participant, or vice versa. Or changing from a counselor to a mediator role, or vice versa there as well. Clients must be fully informed of any anticipated consequences, either if they're financial, legal, personal, or therapeutic, of the counselor role changes. Okay, and that brings us to our third and final polling question. Let me get to it here. And it asks, here it comes, poll number 3. I'm launching it now. The following are considered to result from an individual engaging in a romantic or sexual relationship with their therapist. It was just a slide ago. Is it A, suicide ideation? Is it B, confusion? Is it C, guilt? Is it D, trust issues? Or is it E, all the above? Which of the following are considered to result from an individual engaging in a romantic or sexual relationship with their therapist or counselor? Is it A, suicide ideation? Is it B, confusion? Is it C, guilt? Is it D, trust issues? Or is it E, all the above? Boy, we already have 88% and everybody's right. So I'm just going to do a few more seconds because I just have 8 minutes remaining. I'm waiting on the last two. This one's pretty simple, right, guys? So, 5 seconds of counting. Okay. It's D, all the above. Suicide ideation, confusion, guilt, and trust issues, just to name 4 of them. I think there were 6 or 7 that can happen or result from an individual engaging in a romantic or sexual relationship with their therapist or their counselor. So it can really be harmful to the folks that we're trying to help, right? Okay. So in this last section, I want to look at some ethical issues that might arise that are connected to funding. In this particular journal article I found is actually tied to gambling research, so I thought it would be interesting and relevant. But it is a Canadian study. I want to say that up front because there might be there are some differences, which should be noted. Specifically speaking, that the Canadian provincial governments are both the providers and regulators of gambling services in Canada. And this article references also the Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists. But I still believe, after reading through this, that there's some value hearing what these findings had to say about these guidelines, and they can be applicable in the US as well. In other words, I think this information can be useful for any field that accepts funding from a providing industry. So in other words, in Canada, I know because we're a Canadian company, while they provide the gambling services, they also, I believe, have done research, and this is what the journal article talks about the harmful effects of gambling. So here are 5 obvious ethical concerns when something like this goes on, where the actual provider of the particular service does the research on its own product, okay? This is somewhat a unique setup there in Canada, but it would be like a beer company doing research on the harmful effects of heavy drinking and alcohol. or even where a state would make a particular type of gambling legal, which in most of our states, 48 of them, gambling is, right? In a roundabout way, it would be like providing a gambling service, legalized sports gambling, and then doing a study on the harmful effects of sports gambling in the U.S., right? So the conflicts of interest, some of them are very obvious. Pressure involving funding research that favors the industry, suppression of research, efforts to hide the research that might harm the industry's financial interests, the potential reputational risk associated with researchers that accept the fund from the industry providers, the researchers themselves. Focusing on the problem here in Canada on the individual problem gambler versus the Canadian government who were increasing the availability of gambling venues. In other words, the government really not looking at their own part in it. And restrictions on publishing and lack of disclosure, being above board about it, talking about time frame restrictions, conflicts of interest regarding the sources. But there's also benefits in addition to the financial benefits when funding sources of research comes from the providers. The knowledge translation and exchange of shared knowledge from empirical research. The access to participants. In Canada, they were able to grab gamblers right out of their casinos, right? So to get participants relevant to the study. And finally, if the situation calls for a providing source to be the funding of the research on their own product, then they need to make some considerations. The respect for the dignity of the person. Participants should know the source of the funding. Again, they need to be transparent about that. They need to have a responsible, caring type of attitude and focus, maybe conduct risk-benefit analysis of funding sources to society at large. And if it's too risky, then maybe they need to locate funds elsewhere versus the provider of the service itself. Integrity in relationships, be aware of the dual relationships or the conflicts of interest between like clinicians and the industry providers. And this also applies at the macro level. And then finally, responsibility to society, have that focus to ensure the funding doesn't interfere with the expression of knowledge as it results, or as it can be misused for political or economic advantage. So really what we have to pay attention to is those conflicts of interest and make sure that the folks who read the studies know where the funding came from, right? Not that it's wrong, but just be above board and transparent about it. So let's review real quickly. I have a couple of minutes. Remember, we started with the introduction that provided 3 examples of professional agencies, 2 national, just the ACA, the NASW, and then finally ILDAPCA, the ICB, for ethical mandates and perhaps some information on ethics in our field. We reviewed 7 ethical theories, right? Starting with virtue ethics that base the person's ethical thought on a value system on what their particular society stance on ethics was. We talked about deontology being white or black, that the outcome really didn't matter as long as the process was ethical. In other words, lying in a court of law, even if it meant somebody getting killed out in the streets. That's a deontology approach. Where teleology, it didn't matter about the process, like stealing to feed the hungry, and the result there was ethical, and that's all that mattered with teleology. A motivist theory, ethical standards, sets just ethical standards based on the individual motives, and natural law says plainly do good and avoid evil. The transcultural ethical theory states that all cultural groups should be treated with respect, and the strengths and values of groups are within society itself. And finally, with the feminist ethical theory, it questions the origin, meaning, and implications of society gender roles. But at the end of the day, remember, I said it all falls back to Aristotle's first rule of ethical behavior. The virtue theory stating do no harm and do only what is good for the client, put their needs before our own. We talked about competence, the 8 core ethical standards: fees for service, disclosure and informed consent, confidentiality, non-discrimination and respectful treatment, evaluation and assessment, treatment planning and documentation, and termination. And while we spoke on these 8 standards, we kind of interwove and included those challenging situations that CADCs, PCGCs, all of us that work in the addiction field face. We then finished the section talking about the complicated subject of relationships in addition to to what happens within the therapeutic relationship, speaking specifically on dual relationships, romantic and sexual relationships, and role changes. And finally, I talked about that research of when a funding source actually comes from the provider of the service. We want to be transparent and we want to watch out for those conflicts of interest. Guys, tune in for January 14th at noon, Gambling in the Prison System. We'll get that out to you, the link via the Supra notification alert. Thank you for joining us today and have a great day. Thanks.